What do you do when you have a big presentation coming up, when your career depends on convincing an audience that they should adopt your way of thinking? If you're like most people, you would line up your arguments and talk about as many of them as you could. More is better, right? Well, not so fast. This is what happened in one of the biggest stages in the world, which was the United States presidential debate, the first one to be televised in 1960. Everyone thinks that Vice President Richard Nixon lost because he was less telegenic than his opponent, John Kennedy. That's partly true. However, there's another important component to that. Nixon had all the arguments. He spent his career preparing for a debate like this. He mastered the policy. He mastered the details. And when it came time to debate, he tried to put forward all of his arguments, whereas Kennedy put forward only a fraction of the arguments that Nixon did. The TV audience had a very clear judgment, which was that Kennedy crushed it and Nixon looked lackluster. So Nixon had the advantage. However, he did not present in an effective way. The election was razor thin, and a lot of people think that that first debate is what clinched it for Kennedy. Now, this was 66 years ago, but it does apply anytime we're on deck to present to an audience. We always prepare and line up our arguments and our data and our opinions, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's what good presenters should do. However, research shows that a lot of us make a key mistake when we prepare our presentation, the same mistake Nixon made that cost him the election. So we want to make sure we don't do it, and instead we are effective when we present. Hi everyone, in this video we'll go over something called the presenter's paradox. This is a psychological trap that explains why so many people go wrong in their pitches and presentations. This will change how you prepare for the next talk and all the talks thereafter and make you a much more effective presenter. And as always, I will back everything I say by science. So let's go. So let's start with an example. Imagine you're preparing to pitch the executive team in your company, and you have a successful product, let's say some snack food, and you're asking them to invest in an eco-friendly packaging, a new packaging for your product. So you've prepared your main talking points for your presentation. You came up with three main arguments for your position. One, you have market research data that's pretty rock solid. In 3 test markets, switching to this biodegradable wrapper led to a meaningful increase in sales within 6 months. Turns out a lot of millennials and Gen Zers who are your target customers are willing to pay up for this new wrapping. Good. Second argument, you learned that competitors also rolled out similar green packaging last year, and they saw a lift in their brand loyalty. The third argument is the worst one. A few of your friends actually are well-versed in your company's products, and they mentioned to you that they would feel better buying snacks in an eco-friendly packaging. However, this is mostly anecdotal. So most presenters would take these 3 arguments and stack them up one after another. Maybe they will order them from strongest to weakest and so on. And they would use all of them in their presentation because it seems reasonable. More is better. That's the logic. However, research says that that is a failure in taking the perspective of the audience. See, one theory is what an audience does is they hear a presentation and they add the arguments. Argument 1 plus 2 plus 3, that leads to 3. That's better than just one argument alone. But instead, imagine yourself in the place of the audience. Imagine you were to hear this presentation. What the research says is that audience do not add, but they're averaging. So they take arguments 1, 2, and 3 and average them. And that means that when you take a strong argument and a medium argument and a weak argument, you get something in between because that's the average. But if you were to state only your strongest argument, you are going to be likely to do better because the average of strong is strong and the average of strong, medium, and weak is medium. So the recommendation from this research is just to go with your best argument and leave out the rest. That means leaving out some well-researched arguments that you came up with, some data you came up with, and spent a lot of time gathering. But it's better for your presentation if you want to make an impact. So let's dig into the research and try to understand why this is the case. In a 2012 article, the researchers were inspired by a real case of an airline that experienced a delay and had to compensate its passengers. So what they did was give the passengers a $35 voucher, a meal coupon, and a 25-cent phone card.
Now, the phone card, for those of you who have never seen one, is a prepaid card that lets you make long-distance phone calls.
Now, the airline thought they were sweetening the deal by providing an extra phone card. But the passenger thought that the cheap card made the whole package feel stingy and unattractive. it might very well have been that without giving away the cheap phone card, the airline's compensation would have been seen in a better light. So the researchers formally tested this with an experiment where they asked participants to sell an iPod. They had two options. One is to sell the iPod by itself. The other option is to sell the iPod and add a free downloadable song. So nearly everyone chose to add the downloadable song because they thought that makes the package better. There's a free song there. However, customers were actually willing to pay more for the iPad alone as opposed to the iPod plus the free song download. That small bonus made it feel cheaper overall, the entire package. In another demonstration, the researchers compared different advertisements for hotel. On the one hand, they had a hotel that offered a 5-star pool and a 3-star restaurant. On the other hand, they had a hotel that just offered a 5-star pool without a restaurant. Now, it might seem the first hotel is better because it's got a restaurant, even though mediocre. But when people were asked, how much are you willing to pay per night? They were willing to pay more for the hotel without the restaurant as opposed to the one with the mediocre one. Now, why does this happen? It seems strange that people would prefer the inferior option, but that's only if you're thinking in terms of adding. If you're only thinking in terms of adding economic value, it seems weird. Okay, but the audience wasn't thinking in terms of adding. They were thinking in terms of averaging. And in fact, the researchers argue this is the common way in which we think about things when we are presented to. The average of a great thing and a mediocre thing is lower than the average of just a great thing. Another way to look at it is the following. When you're presenting, when you're thinking about building a presentation, you're thinking in terms of piecemeal, and you're evaluating each part of the presentation separately and adding up all the positive. However, when you're listening to a presentation, you're thinking holistically. You're blending everything into one big picture impression. And that can be seen in another experiment that the researchers did in that paper. What they compared was two combinations of movies. One was a 5-star hit, and the other was a portfolio of 5-star hit plus a 3-star mediocre movie. When people were asked to rate the portfolio as a whole, they correctly predicted that just having the best movie by itself would look stronger than having a portfolio of one strong movie and one weak movie. However, when people rated the movies separately, they thought that adding the mediocre film would help because they were adding in their minds. In other words, people who thought about the big picture first evaluated the offering as a whole, and they acted like an audience would. People who thought about each component separately acted like presenters would. The idea is that as presenters, we miss the forest from the trees. We're very close to our work. We care a lot about our work. We hone every argument, collect every piece of data, and edit every piece of text. And so in our minds, each of these components stands on its own and will be evaluated on its own. In essence, this is a perspective-taking failure. The perspective that we take as presenters is different from the perspective we take on as audiences, and we fail to move on from one perspective to the other when we prepare our presentation. So let's summarize and see what we can get out of this very interesting research. Here are 4 practical tips to avoid this presenter's paradox, to avoid this break in perspective taking, where we as presenters fail to understand how the audience will evaluate us. So the first tip is prioritize your stars. Stick to the 1 or 2 strongest points that you can make to make your case. Ask yourself, does this extra detail truly elevate or just average things down compared to the other things I laid out? Remember, the audience is going to look for a holistic, big picture view of what you're saying, and they're going to judge you based on that. Every single little detail is probably going to escape their mind. 2, force yourself to take on a big picture view. Before you finalize your presentation, look at it at full and ask, how does this whole thing feel? Maybe take a break, take a 30-minute break from it and say, come back to it and read it or listen to it and say, what is the TLDR? What is the bottom line point? If I had to summarize it in 2 sentences, what am I going to get from this presentation? That's going to help you be closer to the perspective of the audience and how they're going to think about what you're saying. 3, this doesn't mean that you shouldn't collect as many arguments to make your case as you can. This doesn't mean you shouldn't collect data. The thing is that you don't know which of the things that you collect and work on is going to be the strongest and most resonant with your audience until you finalize it. The issue here, only when you present. Don't present everything, just present the strongest ones. Having more in your back pocket is still better so long as you don't fall into the mistake of missing the trees from the forest. Finally, get fresh eyes. Show your draft of your presentation to somebody. Maybe speak it or practice it to somebody that you trust, that has good judgment. And Ask for their honest opinion. That person is likely to think like your eventual audience. So that person is going to give you the broad, big picture perspective, and he's going to tell you what they really think about your presentation. So if you mastered these points in your next pitch, speech, or presentation, you can do a really, really good job and be much more effective than most people who sweat the small details and then detract from the main points in their presentation. I hope this was helpful. Please like and subscribe if you like this. I will come up with more psychology, research-backed hacks to make you a better presenter in the future. Let's present smarter, and good luck.